I love being here. Obviously, this is a museum that I consider my home. And this museum is unique in a lot of ways. This is an area where we have many wonderful museums, but only the Tacoma Art Museum has made it their mission to show and collect art from the Pacific Northwest. So that makes it a very special place for Northwest artists. And I have always found the staff here to be very open and, just engaging about any idea that you wanted to do. I remember one time going to Jane Ann Up and having this idea, and she listened to it, and then she said, "I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm sure that you can pull it off." And so, it's a real treat to work with people that care about art like that. I have to thank some people before I start. And I want to start by thanking Jane Ann Up, who was the former director and the woman who raised the money for this new museum, and former curators Patricia McDonnell and Greg Bell, because they helped get the ball rolling for this exhibition. And I want to thank Stephanie Stevich, the current director, and curator Rock Hushka, and especially Rebecca Janes, who is the editor/project coordinator and the person who keeps this place together. When she goes on vacation, the whole place falls apart. But I can never thank those three people enough for all the work that they've done on this exhibition and the catalog. Then to curator Margaret Bullock, Paula McArdle, who's the education director, volunteer coordinator Jana Wenstrom, graphic designer Pepe Soon, registrar Michelle Kenny, and installation designer James Porter and his crew. I also want to say thank you. To Phoebe Kellerman, Zoe Donnell, and Morgan Milongo, who seem to be able to do multiple jobs and do them all well, thank you. There's a lot of other people on the Tacoma Art Museum staff that work here part-time or full-time, that do their stuff behind the scenes and they don't get any of the glamour. I thank them. And also the museum board and the docents who donate their time to keep this place going. I have to thank the people and the organizations who loaned to my exhibition. This was a huge amount of work. I want to thank the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Racine Art Museum in Racine, Wisconsin, the Seattle Art Museum, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and the City of Seattle Portable Works Collection. And then to my private collectors who've really been there for me over the years. Susan Beach, Lois Boardman, Jackie Fowler, Marion Folk, Lynn and Jeffrey Luff, Mia McEldowney, Laura Oskowitz, Judy Wetzel, and Daphne Farrago. Thank you for helping me realize the dream of this project. Special thanks to the Plest Sheaf Foundation, and Susan Beach and Jane Ann and Dale, who wrote generous checks. And then, most importantly, I need to thank the people who make me look good every day. And those people are, so I'm going to get all choked up, my photographer, Rex Reistedt, who is here tonight. Another photographer, I have many photographers. Doug Yapel, Lynn Thompson, Joel Levin, and Robert Liu. The people who represent me in their galleries, William and Sarah Traver, Helen Williams Drutt, Libby Cooper, Mia McEldowney, my attorney, Bob Kaplan, and my friends in the media, Matthew Kangas, Lois Moran, Susan Biscaborn, Robin Updike, Judy Wagenfeld, all these people, Susan Laramniak, Carolyn Benish, Robert Liu, the entire staff of Ornament Magazine. People have been incredibly generous to me over the years in my career. I need to thank Dr. Susan Noyes-Platt, who is here tonight. She wrote the large essay in my book, Professor Michelle LeBaron, who wrote the other essay, visionary Helen Williams Drutt, who wrote the introduction, and curator Rock Hushka, who Rock and I did an interview, but Rock did so much work on this catalog, it's just really hard to point to any one thing that he didn't have a hand in. And then I also want to thank Phil Kovacevic, the book designer, and my studio assistants, Monica Guidici and Kathleen Kennedy. And last but not least, my friends and my family, and especially my husband and my daughter, Will and Avery Reed. I thank them for helping me believe in myself. As my late friend Dick Elliott said, if you don't believe in your own art, nobody else will. So, Now let's sit back and relax. I'm just going to tell you some stories. This is the cover of a book. And if those of you can remember the Nancy comic strip, I feel pretty important that they have a whole comic strip about me. This is initiation necklace, and I want to start by talking about where my ideas come from. I'm considered a narrative artist. That means the two pieces tell stories, and I pretty much make art about my life. And since I started making art when I was in high school, this is a long story. And when I started putting together this talk, I've given this talk many times, talking about my work, and I realized that this isn't just my journey. It's a journey of people of my generation, and especially women of my generation. And our lives have changed a lot. Our lives are a lot different than our mothers. And one of the ways that they changed is in the way we dress. Now, for the young people in the audience, you may think that I'm making this up, but this is true. When I was in junior high school, when I was in school, we had to wear a dress to school every day, a skirt or a dress. When I was in junior high school, they decided to put, they dictated what length the dress had to be. So if your dress was too short, you got sent home from school. And if your dress was too long, you got sent home from school. And the only time you were allowed to wear pants was when it was really cold. And then you had to wear them under your dress. But if your dress matched your pants, that was a pantsuit, and then you got sent home from school for that too. So we grew up at a time when there were different rules, when there were just plain rules. We don't have these rules now. And by the time I got to be a senior in high school, they'd thrown all the rules away. We were all just wearing halter tops and jeans to school, and they were just glad that we showed up. So this is a journey that, people of my daughter's age have no idea the sacrifices and what we went through. The necklace on the left is something I made in college, and it was an assignment from Ken Corey, my mentor, and the assignment was to design something using a Native American motif. So on the right, you see this joke photograph of a giant squash blossom necklace, and that was the composition I decided to work with. And the idea about the piece was initiation rites. Now, jewelry is a very personal art form, and it's been intertwined with the culture and personal lives of human beings since time began. And one of the functions of jewelry is rite of passage. In my family, a rite of passage had a lot to do with hair. My grandmother had a real thing about hair. And so when I turned 12, she decided that I couldn't wear pigtails anymore and that I had to go to the beauty parlor and get a perm. And she also decided that I couldn't wear whatever I wanted to church anymore. I had to wear a suit and I had to wear hose. And my grandmother was a big believer in foundation garments. So my whole life changed at age 12. And for 5 years, I slept on rollers every night until I got to be a senior in high school, and then we started blow drying our hair, and we didn't care about that crap anymore. But, it's hard to believe and to remember that kind of stuff. But we had real initiation rites into womanhood, and that's what my grandmother was trying to do, was to bring me into the world, initiate me as an adult woman. And so I made this piece with hair curlers and chicken bones. It was sort of a metaphor thing. And when I show this slide to college students now, I have to explain what those hair curlers are. This is a Tony perm. And we used to have this ritual where you'd sit in the kitchen and your mom would roll up your hair, and then she'd pour this smelly crap over your head. And, you sat there for, I don't remember. It seemed like 2 hours, but it was probably 20 minutes. And then they rinsed it out. And we went through this ritual, I don't know how many times. Your mom did your hair. You didn't go to a beauty parlor. Your mom did your hair, And everybody knew what this stuff was. Well, now, people don't know what this is. They don't know what they're missing. This is a piece that I made in the early 90s. I started a group of work that after I started it, I started calling it the Middle-Aged Mom Project. And I started making pieces about my life as a way of sort of poking fun at myself and getting myself to laugh about things that I was taking a little too seriously. One of the other milestones that my generation has had to, trailblaze this is this division of labor in the home. Now, my mother was a full-time tenured professor, and she did most of the housework. Then my generation got married, and we told the men, we think you should help out too. Well, it's a lot easier to talk about that than to actually make it happen. So I made this piece about cleaning the bathroom, which was an issue early in my marriage. And it's not an issue anymore because we pay somebody else to do it. This is a necklace that I made not too long after my daughter Avery was born. And I was about 34 years old, and I had been making art for a long time. And all of a sudden, because I had a baby, people expected me to stop making art. They just thought I would stop, because I was a mom. And in fact, I became a better artist after I became a mom because I became more disciplined. And I didn't goof around when I had time in the studio because I didn't have as much time for the studio. So I made this piece with a compass that's about, this odd time when I thought that I was doing the right thing. I believed in myself. I believed that I could be an artist and a mom, but other people weren't quite sure. And on the left is a Victorian necklace with these chains. That was sort of a style of jewelry in the late 19th century. And so I call this period of my work the drippy chain period because a lot of my necklaces had these drippy chains. This is a piece that I made when Avery was about 3 years old. The shoes actually spin around the clock, and they're Barbie doll shoes, and I stole them from Avery and cast them in silver. And the title of the piece is Running Your Mama Ragged, and anybody who's raised a 3-year-old can relate to this. I've made a lot of pieces about parenting. My generation has had a very different attitude about parenting. I'm working on a piece about parenting at home right now, and I recently did just, a very casual survey amongst my friends. I said, what was the punitive tool for disciplining your home? Fly swatter was the tool in our home, and it's pretty common. And some people said, well, they threatened us with a belt, but they never actually went through with it. Well, now, we don't touch kids. And so, there's this thing, I titled this piece Overprotective Impulse because it's about things that I don't believe you should raise children to be afraid. I don't believe that you should shelter them from the world, but I see a lot of people raising them to be fearsome of the world, and they give their kids everything so they don't learn how to work for it. And so you'll see a lot of my opinions about things like child rearing in these pieces. This is another one. These are all from the Middle-Aged Mom Project. I had made a few of these brooches I was really just making them for myself. And then I decided to write a grant for them to Artist Trust. And it was really tongue-in-cheek. I just wrote the grant. I said, I'm a 38-year-old mom, and I make art about parenting and getting fat and money and car repairs. And they gave me the money. So then I had to make this whole body of work, And it was really fun to do. So this is a piece that I made about my 40th birthday, and that's a picture of me on my 40th birthday. When I was in high school, I was just incredibly cool, and I was too cool to go to my senior prom. So when I turned 40, my husband and a couple of very close girlfriends threw me a prom. And we rented a ballroom, and we had a band, and we had a refreshment committee, and a decorations committee, and everybody dressed up, and it was so much fun, And so I made a piece about embracing feminine frivolity because it's fun, Oh, I've made a lot of pieces with money. And I think this was the first one. My generation has had a different attitude towards government. My mother's generation, some of them protested against the government, but many of them supported the government for the war in Vietnam. My generation protested that. We also protested Watergate, you know. And then about the time I made this necklace, every woman in the country was watching the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas thing. And we were all mad as hell. And so I made this piece about, it's called Broken Trust, and about how we used to just trust our leaders and now we don't. And the best way to show the leaders was to cut up, you know, I got up a $1 bill and a $2 bill and a 5 and a 10. I just couldn't bring myself to cut up a 20. But anyway, I was looking at a lot of Art Nouveau necklaces then, and especially the work of René Lalique. And I go to historical jewelry a lot for composition, and this was a man who's known mostly as a glass artist, but he was a jeweler first. And what I loved about his designs is they're endless. You can't see where the clasp is. I just thought that was such a perfect design. So I did several necklaces with that kind of design. This is another one that's in the show. This was a piece, I made this the year that my mentor Ken died, and I inherited a lot of metal from his studio. And I was, you know, thinking about this idea of inheritance and, you know, what you leave to your children, knowing that as an artist I wouldn't have a lot of money to leave to my. So I was thinking about, you know, giving advice and other kind of stuff. So anyway, the title of the piece is Family Fortune, and it has fortune cookies in it, fortune cookie fortunes in it. And these are all set under eyeglass lenses and gold wishbones. So there is a little actual monetary value in it. And then these glass eyeballs. I use the glass eyeballs a lot. They are taxidermy eyeballs. They're handmade, and this is salmon eyeballs. I use a lot of bass and salmon eyes because they're pretty, and because there's a very old tradition in jewelry for warding off the evil eye by wearing an eye. And so that's what this piece is about. This one's called The 7 Deadly Sins. And I made this in response to my neighbor who modified my view of the lake by building up over it. And I was pretty steamed. So I thought, well, she's just so greedy. You know, and so I called my stepdad, who's, you know, sort of walking encyclopedia, and I said, what are the 7 deadly sins? And he just rattled them off, you know. And so this is the 7 deadly sins. And I put things under eyeglass lenses that sort of personified very vaguely on some of them different sins. So, you know, I've got chocolate wrappers for gluttony and, you know, stuff like that. And then that was the same year that People magazine published their 20th anniversary issue, and it had all these wonderful photographs of, you know, celebrities. And so then I put those on the back of the necklace, and I chose a celebrity to match each sin. So like Elvis was gluttony, and Woody Allen is lust, and Lorena Bobbitt, the woman who chopped off her husband's penis, she's wrath. You know. And anyway, this was cathartic for me. It was a way to get it out of my system, and to learn that Buddhist idea, which is you don't have any control over what other people do. The only thing that you can control is how you respond to it. And this was an important lesson for me, but I think it's another thing that my generation needs to address, because my generation has generated a lot of litigation for perceived slights. You know, I mean, really stupid stuff. And wouldn't it be better if we all just sort of did the Buddhist thing and said, well, you know, I'll just get used to it. This piece, it's called Beans in Your Ears. And I made this the year that I was PTA president at my daughter's school. Oh, it was just a year from hell. And I would come home from these meetings, I'd go to my studio and I'd think, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I'll just make art about it, you know. And I was going to these meetings where everybody wanted to talk, but nobody wanted to listen. So I have different ears and they're all stopped up, you know, nobody's listening. And there's earplugs, and I have different, you know, different kinds of ears there. And then, of course, the beans. And I'll probably never sell this necklace because it's too much fun to wear. So whenever I go to a political meeting or I have a new doctor or something, I wear this one, and they'll say, "Oh, what an interesting necklace." And I'll say, "Yes, I have this thing about listening." And then that sort of generates this little discussion about listening. We get that out of the way, and they know what I expect. This necklace is called Terminology. And I was out at Boeing Surplus one day and found this whole box of IBM typewriter balls. Now, for those of you who don't know what an IBM typewriter is, that's a picture of one on the right. And that little orange thing was the top of the balls. And what we used to do to change the font on these things that we called typewriters was you would actually take these little balls out and put a different font in. And my mom had one of these, and she could type so fast it sounded like thunder. So anyway, I stumbled into these typewriter balls, not knowing what I was going to do with them. And then my friend Ramona Sahlberg was putting together a bead show for the Bellevue Art Museum, and I called her because I wanted her to include some of my friend Ken's work. And she said, "Well, you make something." And I said, "Oh, Ramona, I don't do beads." Just real haughty. And she said, "Make something." And so I came up with this. And this is, again, about the PTA meetings. I was sitting in these meetings with a very diverse group. I live in the most diverse legislative district in the state. And we've got everybody. And our meetings are very interesting. And people were unintentionally insulting each other using incorrect terminology. So the silver beads in between the IBM ball beads each address a different hot topic like race or weight or gender preference. And on one side of the bead is the politically correct terminology, and on the other side is the politically incorrect terminology. And you can flip the beads according to which company you're in. These are 2 of 4 credit card bracelets I made, and I was reading about slavery and thinking, what is modern-day slavery? And I decided it was debt. And, debt's another thing that doesn't seem to bother my generation. Our parents saved. We don't. And, back in the olden days, people went to jail for debt. And now we give our kids credit cards and we just, we don't care. So these are 2 very moralistic pieces, and one of them is called Hologram Hell, and the other one's called Hologram Theater. And, for Hologram Theater, I have little alternating comedy tragedy masks, and for Hologram Hell, I have little devils, and then there's some moralistic message inside about the evils of credit, I may be making some more of those. These are a picture of some Mexican bracelets made mid-20th century maybe. Again, I often use historical jewelry to inspire my work, so the hologram bracelets were inspired by these 1950s Mexican silver bracelets. This piece is called Repairing the Nest, and I made it the year that we remodeled our 100-year-old home, and it was really traumatic. Anybody who's been through a big remodel knows how really stressful it is. And this is a piece where, I make these pieces about my own life, but when I show them, then people respond to them, and I realize that people see themselves in these pieces. And so the woman who bought this piece had also been through a remodel, but she was learning how to live without her husband who had recently had a stroke. So it's always interesting to me that other people see their own story in my stories. That's something that I actually deliberately do now, but I didn't start out doing that. This is a piece about being a professional artist. You have to be a creative person and a business person, so it's called Balancing Right and Left. And I've got little brains there from The Visible Woman. I use Barbie and The Visible Woman a lot. This is a piece about another rite of passage. My mother died of ALS in 1998, and losing a parent is a very important rite of passage. And you basically walk through a portal of understanding and come out changed on the other side. So it seemed appropriate for me to make a piece of jewelry about that rite of passage. And my mother lived on a ventilator for the last 6 years of her life, so we have the little trach and the lungs. And this piece is in the Helen Dretton collection show. Oh, this is the one that everybody loves to talk about, but nobody likes to wear. This is a piece that I intentionally made uncomfortable. The beads in the back are made out of sharp lava, so they scratch your neck. And the imagery in the front is just really chaotic looking, you know? And so I showed this to an art historian not long after I made it, and she said, "This looks like Rodin's Gates of Hell." And I said, "Yeah, that would work out." But the story behind it is that one time, several years ago, my husband and I were chopping brush on our property near Ellensburg, and it was really hot, and we were really grouchy, and we were crabbing at each other. And I started thinking how that process was a metaphor for what we had been going through in our marriage. And if you've been married for a long time, like I have, every now and then you've got to stop and, you know, clear out the dead wood so that you can have room for new growth. So anyway, I called this conjugal bushwhacking, and I cannot tell you how many times after I've shown this piece at a lecture, men who don't normally volunteer stuff, you know, have come up to me and said, "Nancy, that piece is so comforting to me. It made me realize that it's not just my marriage that's hard." I said, "No, everybody's marriage is hard." So this was another time when I thought, you know, I wasn't intentionally trying to affect other people's lives, but it was happening. And I showed this piece to the minister that married us, and he said, "That's just genius." This piece is called Grafting, and I had read somewhere that the human brain has an unlimited capacity to learn. Okay? And I grew up in Central Washington where there were a lot of apple trees. And the way that they start new apple trees is they'll start with a disease-resistant rootstock, and then they graft different varieties onto the rootstock. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if, you know, we could do that with people? So, you know, if someone said to you, "Well, you know, I can't do that because I wasn't brought up that way," you can say to them, "Human beings have an unlimited capacity to learn." And, you know, so I made this little brain, and I grafted ears onto it, thinking that, you know, people could learn to be better, you know, listeners. This is the leash. And the leash is the first of what I call my tool pieces. And the tool pieces were inspired by this piece that was at the Tate Museum, the new Tate in London in 2000. And I owe a huge debt to my friend Nadine for this one, because we went to London together, and I would just get exhausted, and I'd say, "Nadine, I can't take it anymore." And she'd say, "Oh no, we're seeing everything." And so we got to this show, and I said, "I'm not going up there." And she said, "Yes, you are." And these are 3 towers. And Louise Bourgeois is, you know, a very famous sculptor, and we have some of her pieces at the Sculpture Garden here. And she does pieces mostly about family. And these 3 towers were made for you not to just look at them, but to understand them in a experience kind of way. So the first one, you climbed to the top of this high tower by yourself and sat at the top of this tower in a chair surrounded by mirrors. And that means you have to take a real good look at yourself. And the second one, you're allowed to take a guide with you, which I sort of interpreted as like a counselor or something. And so Nadine and I went up that one, and then you descend through a dark tunnel. And so that's more like the process of psychotherapy. And then the third one, you are also allowed to take a person, and you go up there, and you can, again, look at yourself. And I thought, I mean, I'm terrified of heights, and these pieces made me physically uncomfortable. But by actually, you know, climbing these towers, I experienced what she wanted me to learn. And I thought, oh my God, wouldn't it be amazing if I could make jewelry that helped people change? And so I started with the leash. And when I was growing up, a way that a man could show his success would be to decorate his wife with, you know, pearls and furs. And Nowadays, women make their own money and they buy their own pearls and furs. But this idea of a leash, that you could wear the leash, or you could wear the necklace and choose to take the leash off. You could choose to let go of that obligation. So about the same time, I was observing women my age, not all of them, but some of them just kind of giving up on their dreams, and it really upset me. And I thought, I want to make jewelry that empowers women. And so I started working on the bone thing again, the bone imagery, and this is the curlers and the bone imagery metaphor again. And I started putting the emphasis of the pieces on the back of the wearer, with this idea of giving them, an exoskeleton, like a crab would have or something, something to empower them. So this is exoskeleton number 1 and number 2, and they're both about bones. And at the same time, I was reading about the history of women's undergarments, and the history is pretty gruesome. These are corsets. One's from 1600 and one's from 18. Women wore corsets for 400 years. Can you believe that? Because we were convinced, people convinced us that it was for our good health, that we weren't strong enough without them. And then this was underwear when I was growing up. It was just kind of the same idea, we weren't strong enough without these really substantial foundation garments. I mean, even the idea that you would call them foundation garments. So I decided I wanted the foundation to be on the outside. I wanted it to be empowering on the outside. So I started this quest. I started asking people, sociologists and psychologists that I knew, about this phenomena of women giving up. And one of the places I looked was in the writings of Gloria Steinemann. There was a book in there by a professor up at Western, Dana Jack, about women and depression. And I learned a lot from that book. And I called Dr. Jack and said, I really am interested in your book, but it's 14 years old. Do you have other stuff? And she said, sure, I'll email you. She emailed me 14 pages of articles about this phenomena. And I thought, oh my God, this is really prevalent. And one of the sources was a Jungian book, Jungian philosophy. And in the Jungian book, they talked about this myth called the descent of Inanna. Now, the descent of Inanna is an ancient myth it's 5,000 years old, and it comes from the Sumerian people, who were the first real civilization. And that's where our soldiers have just left Iraq, but that's where we've been fighting today. That's where, a lot of stories from the Old Testament come from. So anyway, the Cliff Notes version of the descent of Inanna is this. Inanna was the goddess of earth, sky, and fertility. And these were people who, their very livelihood depended on the success of their crops and their herds. And so they worshipped a fertility goddess. And she had a sister, Ereshkigal, who was the goddess of the underworld. And they got along just fine until one of the other gods gave them this male child to raise, because for some reason this guy's mom had turned herself into a tree. And so they raised this kid, and then of course they both fell in love with him. So then Ereshkigal decided to trick Inanna into thinking that she didn't care about this guy. So Inanna was off her guard, and one day Ereshkigal sent in a wild boar to kill him when he was hunting, sending him to the underworld forever. And when Inanna found out, she was really mad. And so she decided to go down and get him. Well, nobody had been to the underworld and come back before. So she did say to her secretary, if I'm not back in 3 days, you better come get me. Send somebody. So you entered the land of Ker through these 7 gates. And what's interesting about this myth is at each gate, it describes a different piece of jewelry that she was asked to take off. When she became a goddess, she put all of her powers in her jewelry. Her sister knew that without that jewelry, she was defenseless. So at each gate, she was asked to take off a very specific piece of jewelry, and then at the last gate, her clothes. So she arrived in Kir, completely naked and defenseless, and her sister said, "Gotcha," and cut off her head and hung her body on a hook. So 3 days went by, and Ninshibur, her secretary, went, "Oh, this is not looking too good." So she went to find one of the big gods, the water god, and she explained what had happened, that Inanna had gone to the underworld to get her boyfriend, and he goes, "Oh, so that's why the animals aren't mating and the crops are drying up. Yeah, we got to get her back." So he sent down a couple of ambassadors to bargain with Inanna. And they said, "Look, you want more people in the underworld, we want more people, above, and if you don't send Inanna back, we won't have more living people, and you won't have more dead people. If you give her back, it's a win-win thing for everybody." And she said, "Okay, but I get Tamaz 6 months out of the year." So they basically split, this guy. And so then the ambassadors, put Inanna back together, and as she ascended from Kir, she got, specific pieces of jewelry back until she came to the surface of the earth, and then she laughed and the world burst into bloom. And this myth is used as a metaphor for something that's very common for middle-aged women, where they go through some kind of descent caused by divorce or death or something. And, they go down in a very low place for a while, but then they come back, and when they come back stronger. And so I couldn't believe that I had found this 5,000-year-old myth that was exactly what I was trying to do. Talk about empowering women, and then, dealt with this phenomena that I was calling spiritual osteoporosis. But anyway, so this is a piece that I called Ereshkigal's hook. And it's about the bottom of despair, when you really hit bottom. And this is a piece that's a phoenix piece, actually. I made it after my mother had died, and I went through a descent. And then one day I was out walking on a country road, and I stumbled into a bunch of butterflies, and I was just surrounded in this cloud of blue butterflies, and I thought, it's time for me to come out of the dumps and embrace the world, and I saw it as a good omen. And then they blew up the kingdom. And my stone cutter went down and got a piece of it and cut the stones in that necklace are pieces of the old kingdom. And the little ears symbolize the butterflies, and there's other things in it, steel that I found on the street, but it's basically this idea of rising from the ashes. This is the piece that really hits home with the middle-aged women. Most of them do, but this one really does. This one, I wanted to design an apparatus for women where you would literally balance, your needs and your family's needs. So there's literally pulleys on either side of this necklace, and in the front, there's little lead weights that are stamped with text, and it says, "I want, I need." And then the weights in the back say, "They want," and "They need." And you can do this constant readjusting, because that's what women my age do. We are constantly readjusting our lives to take care of our parents and our kids, and then constantly trying to find somewhere in all that time for ourselves. It's called lifting weights. This one I call Frozen Dreams, and I made it out of high heels that I found at Value Village and a lot of discarded eyeglass lenses that I get from my optometrist. And I wanted it to look cold. The idea was that I wanted to say to women, look, you put your dreams in the freezer for a while you raised your kids and took care of your parents, but they're still there. Just go take them out of the freezer. They're just waiting for you. And on the right is a picture of Marilyn Monroe, who really made stilettos popular. And so stilettos are really shoes that young women wear. So in my necklace, I'm showing older women how to wear high heels. On the left is a brigandine, and a brigandine was a riveted metal undershirt that foot soldiers in Europe wore in the Middle Ages. And I was working on the piece on the right. I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about how our soldiers didn't have the proper body armor. It really upset me that we would send them over there without the right gear, you know. And so I started thinking, and I realized that my generation of mothers were the first ones to send our daughters into the infantry. And so I started making this armor, this brigandine for, you know, a young woman. And I made it out of metal I found on the street. What would it look like if you had to make armor, you know, from just things you scrounged? It was a very sobering kind of idea that, you know, another trailblazing thing that women my age have endured. This is a piece called Electric Fence, and it's about fear of intimacy. And this is something I've observed in people, not always my age, but sometimes my age or older, that as they grow old, they become more and more fearsome of, you know, being intimate. And it reminded me of growing up. My grandfather had a farm when we were growing up, and he kept cows, and they had electric fence around the cow pasture. And my cousins and I would, you know, we played this game where we dare each other to touch the electric fence and get shocked. And so I was thinking how those people, when you go to give them a hug, they kind of give you a little shock. You know, they're really uncomfortable with it. And the tubes, the porcelain tubes came out of my studio when we updated the electrical system. So the knob and tube, you know, those are the tubes, the porcelain tubes, and there's a cow bone. And this is, you know, this is a pretty wild piece. And this is the last one I'm going to talk about today is called Literal Defense. And I was thinking about armor. So on the left is a piece of armor from the Middle Ages. And on the right is this piece of armor that I made out of aluminum cookware, which, believe it or not, I didn't realize until I went looking for this stuff, is hard to come by. Now, when I was growing up, you could find it everywhere, but now everybody uses a microwave. And I had to hunt high and low. And I got a pot lid, and then I found a cookie sheet on the side of the road and made this thing. And I was very upset at the time. I was teaching in the public schools. I was teaching for the Washington State Arts Commission, and it was really discouraging because, you know, we have so little art in the schools now. And, you know, you go into these schools where they don't have an art teacher, and the principal doesn't know what art is, and the teachers don't know what art is, and they want you to teach a crafts project, and it's just very frustrating. So this is in defense of teaching art. And I stamped all over the aluminum piece quotes from, you know, poets and artists and people like Joseph Campbell who've been advocates for the arts. And I literally, when I go to teach in the public schools, it's like going to battle every day. I mean, you just walk in the door and, you know, brace yourself. And I made it as kind of an awareness of how important it is to have arts education. So one of the things that I stamped into the surface of this piece was a quote by Joseph Campbell, who was a famous scholar and taught us a lot about myths. And he wrote, "Artists are magical helpers, evoking symbols and motifs that connect us to our deeper selves. They can help us along the heroic journey of our own lives." What Joseph Campbell taught me was that myths are just nice little stories until you find your own myth. And my myth was the descent of Inanna. And then you realize that mythology is how we learn, and literature and art is how we learn how to be human. And what I've done in my work is share my experience and try to empower other people with my experience. My generation has rejected the maps of our parents, but we still need maps. We still need someone to show the way. And what he means by artists are magical helpers, he means that artists are the cartographers for the new cultural maps. And we need to encourage and insist on good literature, movies, theater, dance, music, and museums to show us the way. And we have to insist on good arts education for kids. We must insist on this. Because without a new crop of artists, who's going to draw the next map? You know, who's going to show the way? This is a Sioux counting cloth, and this is a memory guide that the chiefs would use every winter. They'd gather, and they would talk about what had happened to the different bands in their tribe, and they would record something on this cloth, an image that would stand for what had happened to their people that year, and they'd use it as a memory guide in telling their story. And that's what my jewelry is for me. It's a memory guide in telling my story. I didn't start out trying to tell other people's stories or the stories of my generation. That sort of just happened. But that's my journey. So thanks for coming to hear me tonight. And any questions? Any weird question? I'll answer any of them. Sure.
How do you see your work changing now that your big show is over, or what did you do?
Oh, my assistant Kathleen is here. She'll tell you that we're just slogging away on the same old stuff. I'm working on another piece on parenting. I'm just so disgusted with my generation on parenting. I just can't say enough about it. So, we're just slogging along, the same stuff.
But aren't you moving more toward these large scale?
Yeah, I like the big pieces. I like the bigger pieces, yeah. Definitely.